Thank you, Chair Ward and members of the Select Committee. I'm Dan Fitzpatrick. I'm the Director of Government Affairs and Advocacy for the American Tiny House Association. I became involved with tiny homes and the tiny home movement, not because I live in a tiny home or even aspire to live in a tiny home. It's because in 30 years as a government official, being whether it be a county administrator, city manager, redevelopment director, or 20 years as a private developer, one of the most difficult things it is for us to create in the municipal or even in the private sector is affordable housing. And so when I became involved with the tiny movement, I saw this as my niche, my tiny niche, of a way of supporting and working with my friends up and down the state and local government to give them ideas on how to utilize tiny houses, whether stick-built or movable tiny houses, in terms of meeting their issues relative to affordable housing. The staff asked me to cover 3 things in 10 minutes, so I'm going to talk quick. One is, what are tiny homes? 2, tiny homes in terms of being used as accessory dwelling units, and 3, tiny homes or movable tiny homes in the utilization for infill properties, whether it be remnant properties, city-owned properties, or whatever, for affordable housing. First of all, what is a tiny house? And tiny houses are basically now defined legally in the new 2018 International Residential Code as being, homes less than 400 square feet. In general, as you may know, in California law, efficiency apartments are 150 square feet, plus. So that's basically your range of quote-unquote tiny homes. And so tiny homes can range anything from stick-built, movable. We even have a number of stackable, units. I think Michael was talking about some of the things that can be done in the private sector using factory-built components that you can stack, and a number of these I know are being built in the Bay Area. I don't know if you have these in San Diego at this point in time. In terms of what is a movable tiny house, they're generally 8.5 feet wide. If you're buying one that you want to move regularly up and down the highways of the state of California or nationally, it can't exceed 8.5 inches wide. And none of them can be over 13.5 feet tall, right? So they're always under 14 feet, which is normally your limitations for second story and your various codes. But many of the movable tiny houses that are only being moved occasionally, they're moved mainly from the factory to the lot, and maybe moved every 5 years or so. They're being bought up to 10 feet wide. So that's what a tiny house is, and as I said, it's a range. We also support containers and other types of building that's 400 square feet or less. Now, what are movable tiny houses? Movable tiny houses are not your conventional RV. In fact, if you write an ordinance to define movable tiny houses, I can show you 100 different ways of writing it in such a way that none of these will ever be considered a movable tiny house. Movable tiny houses are built to resemble a typical cottage or bungalow. And these are typical pictures of units that are located in different areas in California. They're basically if you go to the next slide, a stick-built house. The foundation just happens to be on a chassis versus on a concrete, slab or foundation, built with the same 2x4, wood or steel construction, all of the support, the plumbing, electrical, and so forth, built in accordance with code. You can have many different designs depending on the particular neighborhood in which it plans to go, that you can put any type of facade you want on these particular units. And certainly the interiors are designed to meet all of your requirements for habitation, for living, sleeping, cooking, and sanitation. Key words right out of the health and safety code for a habitable dwelling unit. In fact, these units are actually built stronger than a stick-built house because they're made to be able to go 70 miles an hour down the freeway, and hit a, pothole. And if you look at the interiors here, you will find no drywall. You can imagine what a pothole would do with drywall or plaster on the interior. They're all very well built, so you got basically your sheathing on both sides is, wood or whatever holding it together. Movable tiny houses, one thing that's, people say, why not a stick-built, ADU or, versus a movable. Well, many people have, want flexibility. They may only need it for 5 or, 6 or 7 years in their backyard as an ADU. Many of them are truly being used as granny flats or caregiver facilities, or to put a family member through college, or a family member or friend comes back from overseas tour, needs to get their life together. It's perfect, way of doing that very quickly and conveniently. One of the quick items I'll go through, affordability analysis. You can buy a movable tiny house. There's a couple shops right up in Fresno to buy them. I can buy a really nice, well-appointed tiny house for $75,000. And let's say it costs another $10,000 for a pad and a foundation type of thing in a backyard. I'm invested for $85,000. I can rent that all day, certainly here in San Diego, for $1,000 or $900. I use $900. That's certainly very affordable. Even at that, if I as an investor bought that and put it in my backyard, my return on investment is over 13%. If it was $1,000 a month, I'm 15% return on investment. So in terms of the actual buyer and user of it, if you're renting it out, you get a very good return on your investment. As it relates to the city, those types of units certainly meet your requirements for low and moderate income, family in terms of rents. In order to keep those rents low, the various cities are coming up with some creative ideas of providing incentives to keep rents low in order to meet various income levels. These income levels are used based on 30% of one's income to calculate what you can afford for housing. We'd all kiss the ground if we were only spending 30% of our income. Over 50% of Californians today are spending 50% or more of their income on housing. The big item to me, being both former city manager and county administrator, the cost to the taxpayer of doing a movable tiny house in the backyard is zero. And I'm glad that the council eliminated the fees for accessory dwelling units. Why cities are not dropping pamphlets from airplanes to urge folks to put in accessory dwelling units in their backyard is beyond me, because your choice literally is zero, or if you're going to, our friends here, a developer, to subsidize a stick-built house, the cost is $300,000 per unit, right? So you have a choice, zero or $300,000 per unit out of the taxpayers' coffers. Under current San Diego codes, these units would be legal accessory dwelling units. And you'd all like these. These are nice little units that'd be great in the backyard. But these are not legal. They have those pesky wheels. It's a difference without substance. Legal? Not legal. There's a difference without substance. So if you want to do what other cities are doing in terms of legalizing and permitting, at least as accessory dwelling units, movable tiny houses, is you simply, and I'm not going to go through the elements of a definition, that you simply define in your code a definition for a movable tiny home, just like you have in your code a definition for an RV. Well, you put in your code a definition of a movable tiny house to differentiate it from a typical and conventional RV. Been working with the mayor's Affordable Housing Task Force up in LA, And we got through 2 subcommittees of the City Council, and it's now pending before the City Council to permit movable tiny houses as habitable ADUs in LA. And our friends at the Department of Housing and Community Development, as you know, they always comment on accessory dwelling unit ordinances, and their comment to the City of LA is what you read right there is movable tiny houses. Housing and Community Development supports the city efforts to explore and allow a variety of housing choices, including permitting movable tiny houses as ADUs. So if staff or other folks start getting real nervous about what the state says, you already have it in writing from the policy manager of the State Department of Housing and Community Development that they support them as habitable accessory dwelling units. Moving on to now infill housing, you certainly can use, tinies as infill, especially on remnant, parcels of property. Every city, I haven't found a city yet, and former redevelopment director I know, we're always looking, what can we do with these weird little parcels that we have hanging around that, are left over from construction or a Caltrans project or, or whatever. And tinies are absolutely perfect for that. In this room, this footprint, I could put 4 tiny houses easily if I raise the ceiling to 13 feet, 6 inches, right? But, and what is especially good as it relates to the homeless. Some people say use tinies, these tinies or movable tinies as shelters. And yes, you can, but that's fairly expensive to do it. The biggest problem, and we talked to the founders group, yesterday here in, San Diego, is the biggest problem you find is not shelter. Yes, shelter is a big issue, not because it's mainly a NIMBY issue, not a issue of building shelters. That's easy. It's finding where to put it. But the biggest problem is after I've got my homeless population into shelters, where do I move them to? Where do they graduate to? Once they're stabilized, where do they move to? Tinies are perfect for, especially if I had a remnant property where I can put 4 or 5 together. That's great for a place to move someone that's now been stabilized into a house, a tiny house that can be, utilized. Because it's too small to provide services, but it's big enough to provide, that first step up for folks. Right now, unfortunately, we graduate